I walked into courtroom number 5 at the New York State Supreme Court, my heart pounding with the familiar mix of anticipation and quiet resolve. The room was packed tighter than a subway car during rush hour, lawyers in sharp suits huddled over briefs, reporters scribbling furiously on notepads, and clusters of law interns like me, wide-eyed and eager, filling the back rows. The air smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, the kind that lingers from too many long sessions. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany benches, but it did little to warm the chill of the institutional atmosphere. At 28, I, Danielle Brooks, had grown accustomed to blending in. As a black woman navigating the legal world, I'd learned to move with purpose but without drawing unnecessary attention. Today, I wore my earth-toned suit, professional, understated, nothing flashy. It was my armor, chosen carefully to project competence without inviting scrutiny. I slipped into the second row behind the bar, pulling out my thin notebook. This was routine for me, observing high-profile hearings for my research at Hamilton Law School. The case today was a televised evidentiary hearing on a civil rights violation, the kind that could set precedents. I flipped open my notebook, pen poised, ready to jot down procedural nuances that might feed into my ongoing reports on judicial ethics. The gavel cracked like thunder as Judge Morton Cresswell ascended the bench. He was a fixture in these courts, a silver-haired white man in his late 60s, with a reputation for iron-fisted rulings and a gaze that could freeze you in place. Proceedings began smoothly, lawyers presenting arguments with practiced eloquence. I focused on my notes, capturing subtle biases in his questioning, the way he interrupted the plaintiff's counsel more often than the defense. It was subtle, but patterns like these were my specialty. Then, without warning, his eyes locked onto me. The room seemed to narrow. "You there, young lady," he barked, his voice booming through the microphone. "Stand up." My pulse quickened, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I rose slowly, smoothing my jacket, aware of every eye turning toward me. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, leaning forward. "This is a courtroom, not some community center drop-in." The words hit like a slap, laced with disdain that made my skin burn. I felt exposed, reduced to a stereotype in seconds. But I held my ground, my mind racing. This was just the beginning. I hadn't even opened my mouth to respond when Judge Cresswell barreled on, his voice dripping with mockery that echoed off the courtroom walls. "I don't know where they taught you to dress like that for court," he sneered, his eyes raking over my suit as if it were rags. "You look more like a receptionist than a law student. Honestly, is this what passes for professional these days?" The words landed like acid, burning through my composure. The entire room fell into a stunned hush, broken only by a few scattered snickers from the back, sharp, cruel sounds that made my cheeks flush with humiliation. I could feel the weight of every gaze, the lawyers pausing mid-note, the reporters perking up like vultures sensing drama, and the interns shifting uncomfortably. Behind me, a white male student in a crisp button-down stifled a laugh, his hand covering his mouth as he fumbled for his phone, angling it discreetly to capture the moment. Probably for some viral clip, turning my degradation into entertainment. My fingers tightened around my notebook, knuckles whitening, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. Inside, a storm raged, years of microaggressions flashing back, the sidelong glances in law school halls, the assumptions that I was there on a diversity quota. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crack. "With all due respect, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, "I am an intern from Hamilton Law School, with a recommendation letter from the district attorney's office." I held my ground, refusing to shrink under his stare. The judge leaned back, a condescending chuckle escaping his lips. "Oh, really? Hamilton, you say? I thought a place like that would teach you how to maintain decorum in a hearing. Sit down, and next time, don't waste everyone's time with your inappropriate presence." The phrase inappropriate presence hung in the air like a noose, implying so much more than my attire, my race, my existence in this space. It was a public stripping of my dignity, broadcast live for the world to see. As I lowered myself back into the seat, the snickers grew bolder, a ripple of amusement from those who saw me as an easy target. My mind raced, cataloging every detail, his tone, the crowd's reaction, the way his words weaponized my appearance. This wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of who belonged here and who didn't. But deep down, I knew, I had tools he couldn't imagine. My pen hovered over the page, ready to turn this moment into something far more powerful than his fleeting authority. I eased back into my seat, the wooden bench creaking under me like a reluctant witness. The courtroom's murmurs swelled again, a low hum of resumed conversations, but I tuned them out. No outburst, no sharp retort, I'd long since mastered the art of restraint in spaces designed to belittle people like me. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my notebook, but outwardly, I was a picture of calm. Inside, though, a fire simmered, not wild rage, but a focused heat, forged from countless encounters where my presence alone was deemed provocative. I refused to feed his ego with a reaction he'd twist into defiance. As the judge shuffled papers on his elevated perch, our eyes met across the divide. Me, down here in the gallery, him up there like some untouchable arbiter. Yet in that locked gaze, something shifted. He paused, his pen hovering mid-signature, a flicker of unease crossing his stern features. It wasn't terror in his expression, nothing so dramatic, but a subtle hitch, as if he'd glimpsed an undercurrent he couldn't quite place. My stare held steady, devoid of fury or tears. Instead, it carried knowledge, the quiet certainty that his words had just etched themselves into a record he'd regret. I didn't blink first, he did, averting his eyes to bark an order at the bailiff, his voice a notch tighter than before. The moment broke, but it lingered in my chest like a promise. I flipped open my notebook once more, the pages whispering under my fingers. With deliberate strokes, I penned, documented overt bias in appearance-based commentary. Forward to Judicial Ethics Oversight Channel for formal review. Each word felt like a brick in a wall I was building, one that would shield not just me, but others who'd face this bench in the future. The ink dried quickly, sealing the entry. Around me, the hearing droned on, lawyers rising to argue points of procedure, but my mind was already mapping the path ahead. This wasn't defeat, it was the start of a calculated response. I'd turn his dismissal into data, his arrogance into evidence. As the clock ticked toward recess, I closed the book, slipping it into my bag. The weight of it grounded me, my silent weapon in a war of words and power. Whatever came next, I was ready, armed with patience and precision he could never anticipate. After the morning evidentiary hearing wrapped up, the hallway outside courtroom number 5 buzzed with activity, a chaotic swirl of footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Attorneys rushed by with stacks of files, clerks pushed carts laden with documents, and knots of people lingered in hushed discussions. I stepped out into the fray, my mind still replaying the judge's cutting remarks, but determined to shake it off. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow, amplifying the sense of exposure I felt, like every passerby knew about my public dressing down. I paused near a water fountain to collect myself, sipping slowly from a paper cup, when I overheard voices from a cluster of interns just a few feet away. They were huddled in a tight circle, their backpacks slung over shoulders, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to my proximity. A tall white guy in a rumpled polo shirt leaned in, his tone laced with false whisper that carried deliberately, "Can you believe someone shows up to court and doesn't even handle a simple call-out gracefully? Like, if that's how she acts now, who's gonna take her seriously as an attorney down the line?" His words sliced through the air, aimed right at me without naming names, but the intent was crystal clear. A girl next to him, with perfectly straight blonde hair and a notebook tucked under her arm, let out a sharp giggle that grated on my nerves. Right? And the way she just sat there scribbling away, acting all superior. As if she's about to take over the bench or something. It's hilarious, really. Their laughter bubbled up, low but pointed, drawing a couple of glances from nearby staff. I stood there, frozen for a split second, the cup crumpling slightly in my grip. The sting was fresh, layering onto the morning's wound, a reminder that prejudice didn't stop at the courtroom door. It seeped into every corner, amplified by those who felt safe in numbers. They didn't know me, didn't care to. To them, I was just the outsider who'd been put in her place. But I swallowed the urge to confront them, knowing it would only fuel their narrative. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket, fingers brushing against the cool plastic of my special access card from the Federal Legal Institute. With a subtle motion, I swiped it through the reader on a nearby restricted door, the one leading to the observer's lounge reserved for credentialed advisors. The lock clicked open with a soft beep, and I pushed through without a backward glance. The door swung shut behind me, muffling their chatter, leaving me in a quieter space where I could breathe. Here, away from the judgment, I reminded myself, their words were noise, but my purpose was signal. This hallway moment was just another thread in the tapestry I was weaving, one that would soon unravel their assumptions. That afternoon, the courtroom reconvened for the next phase of arguments, the air thicker with tension from the earlier spectacle. I had received an invitation to occupy a seat at the expert observers table, a section reserved for those with accredited roles in legal analysis. It was a small victory, earned through my credentials, not confrontation. As I settled in, smoothing the edges of my documents, I sensed the shift in dynamics. The space felt charged, like static before a storm, with attorneys exchanging glances and the judge's clerk organizing files with hurried efficiency. Judge Cresswell re-entered, his robe swishing authoritatively as he ascended the steps. His scan of the room halted abruptly on me, his brow furrowing into deep lines. He adjusted his glasses, leaning into the microphone with a voice that carried an edge sharper than before. "I believe I made it clear this session is for those with direct legal obligations," he stated, his tone laced with irritation, as if my mere placement challenged his domain. A murmur rippled through the assembly, heads turning subtly in my direction. Before I could respond, a court officer approached the bench, cupping a hand to whisper urgently in his ear. I caught fragments, references to protocols and verifications, but Cresswell's expression remained unyielding. He waved the officer away with a dismissive flick, then addressed me directly, his words dripping with condescension. "Fine, proceed with your observation. But mark my words, watch only. Leave the expertise to the adults in the room." The phrase hung heavy, implying immaturity where none existed, a veiled jab at my youth and perhaps more. I nodded once, measured and composed, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I always honor true expertise," I replied evenly, my voice projecting just enough to fill the silence, especially when it's applied according to professional guidelines. The statement was subtle, a gentle prod rather than a thrust, woven with implication. It wasn't defiance, it was a mirror held up to his conduct. Around me, several attorneys lifted their heads, pencils pausing mid-stroke, their expressions shifting from passive interest to intrigued alertness. One seasoned prosecutor across the aisle arched an eyebrow, jotting something quickly, while a defense counsel whispered to her colleague, the exchange brief but telling. In that instant, the atmosphere altered imperceptibly, a crack in the facade of unchallenged authority. My heart steadied, the earlier humiliation receding as I focused on the proceedings unfolding. This wasn't about personal vindication yet, it was about planting seeds that would grow under scrutiny. As arguments resumed, I leaned forward, absorbing every detail, knowing my presence now carried an unspoken weight. The judge cleared his throat, calling the next witness, but his rhythm seemed off, a faint disruption in his usual command. I allowed myself a private resolve, patience would reveal the rest. As the afternoon arguments wound down, the courtroom's energy ebbed, replaced by the rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Judge Cresswell, still commanding from his perch, pivoted to solicit input from the Federal Legal Institute's representative, a routine step in complex cases like this one. He gestured toward the side table where advisory documents awaited, his voice carrying that same authoritative clip. Let's hear the Institute's perspective on this evidentiary standard. Clerk, pass up the prepared summary. The court assistant nodded briskly, gathering a thick binder from the stack and ascending the steps to the bench. I watched from my spot, my pulse steady but alert, as she handed it over. The cover caught the overhead lights, its embossed seal gleaming, a federal emblem denoting high-level review. But what truly mattered was the label beneath, bold letters stating, revised and vetted by Danielle Brooks, Interagency Academic Commissioner, State-Level Evaluation Clearance. Cresswell's fingers froze midway through flipping the front page. His posture stiffened, the color draining slightly from his cheeks as he absorbed the inscription. For a fleeting second, his composure cracked, not a dramatic shatter, but a visible glitch in his unflappable facade. He cleared his throat twice, louder than necessary, before resuming his scan, though his eyes darted back to the name repeatedly. The room didn't erupt, but a subtle undercurrent stirred, attorneys exchanging sidelong looks, one jotting a quick memo, another whispering to an aide. Down in the rows, the interns who'd mocked me earlier fell silent, their earlier bravado evaporating. Whispers spread like wildfire among them. Commissioner? Wait, that's her name on the doc. She's not just an intern? How's that possible? Their voices carried just enough to reach me, laced with confusion and a hint of awe. I didn't react outwardly, keeping my focus on my own annotations, but internally, a quiet satisfaction bloomed. This wasn't vengeance, it was revelation, the first glimpse of the layers I'd kept hidden, now surfacing without fanfare. The judge recovered swiftly, slamming the binder shut with more force than needed. Proceed with the next witness, he ordered, his tone clipped, avoiding any glance in my direction. Yet the seed was planted, the atmosphere had shifted, pregnant with unspoken questions. As proceedings dragged on, I felt the balance tipping, my inappropriate presence transforming into an undeniable force. This odd detail, emerging unbidden, was the pivot I'd anticipated, unraveling assumptions one revelation at a time. By session's end, as people filed out, the whispers had grown into a murmur of speculation, and I rose with renewed poise, knowing the real unraveling was just beginning. 3 days later, I returned to courtroom number 5 for the preliminary hearing in a tangled civil lawsuit involving corporate misconduct. The stakes were high, with media outlets already buzzing about potential implications for state regulations. I arrived early, claiming my position in the advisory auditors section, a vantage point I'd secured through official channels. The room filled gradually, plaintiffs' team poring over exhibits, defense attorneys conferencing in low tones, and a fresh wave of observers trickling in. At precisely 8 a.m., the doors swung open for Judge Cresswell's entrance, his footsteps deliberate, echoing authority. He scanned the assembly as he took his seat, his expression hardening when he spotted me. No nod of acknowledgement, just a tightening of his jaw that betrayed simmering resentment. He rapped the gavel sharply, the sound cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Order, he intoned, then paused dramatically before launching into his opening remarks. His voice boomed louder than usual, laced with a theatrical flair. I'm pleased to see so many eager learners returning to absorb the intricacies of justice. Though it seems a few believe they're here to instruct the one wielding the gavel. The jab was unmistakable, aimed squarely at me, cloaked in generality but pointed enough to elicit stifled chuckles from scattered corners, echoes of the same derision I'd endured before. The chamber grew still, the air thick with anticipation. Eyes darted my way, some curious, others smug, as if waiting for me to falter. I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I uncapped my pen and began noting the session's preliminaries, my script flowing evenly across the page. The young deputy prosecutor beside me leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear as he murmured, "He's baiting you deliberately. Don't let it rattle you." His concern was genuine, a rare ally in this arena, but I merely nodded subtly, appreciating the solidarity without breaking focus. In my notebook, I inscribed a single, poignant line, when authority dreads its own reflection, it resorts to mocking the mirror. The words captured the essence of his escalation, a defensive posture masquerading as dominance. Tension coiled around us like an invisible spring, ready to snap. Cresswell proceeded with jury instructions, but his delivery carried an undercurrent of strain, his glances flicking toward me more frequently. The lawsuit's opening statements unfolded, yet the real drama simmered beneath, his intensified antagonism, a sign that my quiet persistence was burrowing under his skin. I sat poised, absorbing it all, aware that this provocation marked a turning point. His attempts to diminish me only highlighted his vulnerability, and as the morning progressed, I felt the invisible scales tipping further in an unforeseen direction. During the mid-morning recess, the courtroom emptied in a steady stream, participants spilling into the adjacent corridors for hurried breaks. I made my way to the water cooler in a quiet alcove, needing a moment to hydrate and reset amid the building pressure. The cool liquid soothed my throat, but my thoughts churned over Cresswell's latest barbs, his amplified sarcasm a clear sign of unease bubbling beneath his veneer. As I discarded the empty cup, an older attorney from the Federal Bar Association approached, his salt-and-pepper beard framing a thoughtful face etched with decades of experience. He carried a worn leather briefcase, the kind that spoke of countless battles won and lost. "You're Brooks, aren't you?" "Danielle Brooks," he asked, his voice gravelly yet warm, extending a hand in greeting. "Yes, that's me," I replied, shaking it firmly, intrigued by the recognition in his eyes. "I've come across your scholarly work on ethical breaches in Eastern District proceedings," he continued, adjusting his tie as if recalling specifics. "Were you the primary author on that piece?" "I handled the final revisions and approvals before submission to federal oversight," I explained, keeping my tone neutral but informative. He paused, absorbing the detail, his expression shifting from casual interest to genuine realization. A beat passed, his brow creasing slightly. "Ah, that explains it," he said slowly, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidential insight. "No wonder Cresswell's on the defensive. Your analyses have a way of exposing cracks in the foundation, ones folks like him prefer to ignore." His words landed with quiet impact, validating the undercurrents I'd sensed. It wasn't just my imagination, others were noticing the judge's escalating tactics, linking them to my unobtrusive role. A spark of affirmation ignited within me, not triumph, but confirmation that my persistence was registering beyond the bench. The attorney nodded appreciatively, adding, "Keep at it. The system needs voices like yours to hold the line." He patted my shoulder before moving on, leaving me with a renewed sense of alliance in this adversarial environment. As the break wound down, I lingered briefly, watching clusters reform, some casting furtive glances my way, their conversations hushed but animated. Whispers of doubt circulated, questions about my credentials, murmurs pondering why the judge seemed so rattled. The skepticism wasn't universal yet, but it was spreading, like ripples from a stone tossed into still waters. This external validation fueled my resolve, the pieces were aligning, and Cresswell's fortifications were showing where. Returning to my seat as the session resumed, I felt the momentum building, an invisible tide turning in ways he couldn't yet control. The session resumed with a palpable edge, the judge's earlier provocations hanging in the air like smoke. Arguments over evidence admissibility intensified, voices rising as counsel clashed over procedural technicalities. Then came the flashpoint. A defense attorney stumbled during cross-examination, fumbling a key exhibit reference that exposed a glaring inconsistency in the timeline. Cresswell's reaction was immediate and severe. He slammed his palm on the bench, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. "Counsel, this is not amateur hour," he thundered, his face reddening. "You have wasted enough of the court's time with sloppy preparation. Fix it or sit down." The lawyer shrank back, mumbling an apology, while the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The judge's outburst felt disproportionate, a release of pent-up frustration that everyone sensed was aimed beyond the podium. In the charged silence that followed, I raised my hand slowly, deliberately, enough to be noticed without aggression. The room's attention swiveled toward me, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Cresswell's eyes narrowed, his lips thinning into a line. "Yes," he snapped, the word laced with warning. "Your Honor, with the court's permission," I said calmly, "I request to supplement the record in my capacity as advisor from the Judicial Ethics Commission." My voice carried steadily, neither raised nor hesitant. He leaned forward, incredulous. "You have no standing to speak here," he retorted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This is not your forum." Before the tension could escalate further, the court clerk rose from her station, document in hand. "Your Honor," she interjected respectfully, "under Rule 14-3B of the Federal Oversight Guidelines, Ms. Brooks's credentials, verified by the Bureau of Judicial Affairs, grant her the right to provide advisory input when invited by either party." Cresswell's jaw tightened visibly, his fingers drumming on the bench. A beat of silence stretched, heavy with implication. The plaintiff's lead counsel, sensing the opening, stood promptly. "I formally invite Ms. Brooks to address the evidentiary point," he declared, his voice firm and decisive. The judge froze, his authority momentarily suspended. His gaze flicked to the clerk, then back to me, calculating the fallout. He exhaled through his nose, a sound of reluctant concession. "Proceed," he muttered, the word forced out like it burned his tongue. I rose smoothly, stepping to the front of the observers' area. The room had gone utterly quiet, no whispers, no rustling papers. Every eye was on me. I met Cresswell's stare directly, unflinching. "If Your Honor intends to maintain authority by suppressing facts," I said, my tone even but unmistakable, "then you may have chosen the wrong individual to challenge today." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Cresswell's face drained of color, his posture rigid as stone. No retort came. The chamber held its collective breath, the shift irreversible. What had been a one-sided power play now teetered on exposure, the judge's dominance cracked open for all to see. I returned to my seat amid the stunned hush, the weight of that single sentence echoing long after it was spoken. The next morning dawned crisp and unforgiving, the kind that sharpens every sense as I made my way back to courtroom number 5. Whispers of yesterday's confrontation had already spread through legal circles, but I pushed them aside, focusing on the folder in my bag, my compiled notes, now a dossier of observations ready for escalation. The chamber filled early, a mix of regulars and newcomers drawn by the rumor mill, attorneys adjusting ties, clerks stacking dockets, and a heightened security presence at the doors. At 9 a.m. sharp, the proceedings were set to begin, but an unexpected stir rippled from the entrance. A delegation from the Federal Judicial Oversight Committee entered in formation, 5 figures in tailored suits, carrying briefcases stamped with official seals. They moved with purposeful strides, parting the crowd like a wave. Leading them was a stern woman in a deep blue ensemble, her posture exuding unassailable command. She signaled to her team, who fanned out to strategic seats, while she advanced directly to the front. Judge Cresswell, already seated, froze mid-conversation with his aide. His eyes widened as she approached the bench, presenting a sheaf of documents with crisp efficiency. "Your Honor," she announced, her voice projecting clearly without amplification, "the Federal Oversight Committee hereby confirms our independent audit of these sessions, pursuant to ongoing annual inquiries into judicial conduct." The room erupted in subdued chaos, lawyers bolted upright, notebooks flipping open, reporters scrambled for recorders, even the bailiff straightened, sensing the shift. Cresswell's hand gripped the gavel tighter, his knuckles paling. But the real bombshell came next. The lead inspector turned slightly toward me, gesturing inclusively. "We also affirm the attendance of Danielle Brooks as our special ethics advisor, tasked with primary oversight on discrimination filings at the state level." Gasps punctuated the air. Heads swiveled en masse, attorneys rising halfway from chairs, interns gaping openly. One prosecutor muttered audibly, "Special advisor? From federal?" The defense table exchanged frantic glances, papers shuffling in disarray. I remained seated initially, absorbing the validation, my heart steady amid the upheaval. This wasn't coincidence, my reports had triggered this intervention, pulling strings I'd set in motion discreetly. Cresswell's face contorted, a mask of controlled fury cracking at the edges. He scanned the delegation, then me, realization dawning like a storm cloud. The power dynamic inverted in an instant, no longer his unchallenged realm, but a scrutinized stage where every past slight now loomed as evidence. As the inspector stepped back, the chamber hung in suspended animation, the weight of federal authority pressing down, ready to reshape everything. The lead inspector's declaration still echoed when she pressed on, her voice slicing through the stunned quiet like a blade through fog. Pursuant to federal mandate, she stated firmly, Ms. Brooks holds authority to intervene at any juncture should she identify breaches in professional conduct standards. The words dropped like stones into a pond, sending shockwaves across the assembly. Those who'd once smirked at my expense, the interns with their sly giggles, the attorneys who'd averted their eyes, now sat rigid, mouths agape, their earlier derision evaporating into awkward silence. A few shifted in their seats, papers forgotten, as if the air had grown too heavy to breathe. Cresswell, perched on his throne-like bench, gripped the edges with white-knuckled hands. His face twisted into a mask of disbelief, eyes darting from the inspector to me and back. He leaned toward his aide, a young clerk who'd been scribbling notes furiously, and hissed under his breath, loud enough for the front rows to catch, "Why the hell wasn't I informed that she's a federal-level advisor?" The aide, pale and hesitant, leaned in closer, replying in a tense murmur, "Because she never advertised it, sir. She let your actions expose themselves." The exchange was brief, but it carried across the hushed space, amplifying the judge's vulnerability. His shoulders slumped fractionally, the unassailable figure cracking under the weight of revelation. I remained composed in my chair, my hands folded atop my notebook, absorbing the reversal without a trace of gloating. Inside, a profound shift occurred, not vindictive joy, but a deep-seated affirmation of my strategy. For so long, I'd navigated these halls as an enigma, my expertise veiled to test the system's biases. Now, unveiled by official decree, it reframed every prior slight, my attire, my notes, my silence, all transformed from weaknesses into calculated strengths. The plaintiff's counsel nodded subtly in my direction, respect flickering in his eyes, while the defense team huddled, whispering urgently about potential ramifications. The inspector stepped aside, signaling the end of her preamble, but the transformation was absolute. No longer was I the dismissed outsider, I embodied federal scrutiny, a living check on unchecked power. Cresswell cleared his throat, attempting to regain control with a gruff call to order, but his voice wavered, stripped of its former thunder. The gavel fell with less conviction, the sound hollow in the reconfigured room. As proceedings haltingly continued, I felt the tide fully turn, my identity, once weaponized against me, now a shield reshaping the very ground beneath us. I stepped forward into the well of the courtroom, the polished floor cool beneath my heels, as the inspector's affirmation lingered like an unyielding echo. The space felt smaller now, compressed by the collective gaze of everyone present, attorneys frozen mid-motion, clerks clutching clipboards, and the once smug observers now wide-eyed and mute. No one dared interrupt, the revelation had stripped away the usual chatter, leaving only the faint hum of the ventilation system. Positioning myself before the bench, I lifted my chin and locked eyes with Cresswell. His earlier bluster had evaporated, replaced by a hollow stare that betrayed the man behind the robe. The lines on his face deepened, shadows playing across his features under the harsh courtroom lights. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching near the gavel as if debating whether to reclaim control through force of habit. In the profound quiet, I began, my words measured and resonant, "I don't require respect based on titles alone. What I demand is for every citizen, every student, every peer, and especially those like you, to treat others as deserving of dignity, regardless of who you assume they are." The sentence unfolded deliberately, each phrase a deliberate counter to his past dismissals. It wasn't an attack, it was a mirror, reflecting his biases back at him in front of witnesses who'd enabled them. Cresswell's mouth parted, a retort forming on his lips, perhaps a habitual command or denial, but it died unspoken. He hesitated, his breath catching audibly in the microphone. His hand, resting on the bench's surface, began to tremble faintly, the subtle quiver betraying a fracture in his facade. The gavel slipped slightly from his grasp, clattering softly before he caught it. Color rose in his cheeks, not from anger this time, but from the dawning horror of exposure. He averted his gaze, staring at the wood grain as if it held answers, his shoulders hunching imperceptibly. The impact rippled outward, a defense lawyer exhaled sharply, breaking the spell, a plaintiff representative nodded slowly, approval etched on her face. Even the federal team observed with neutral satisfaction, their presence amplifying the moment's gravity. Cresswell attempted to straighten, clearing his throat with a rasp, but the damage was done, his aura of invincibility shattered, reduced to a man grappling with the consequences of his own hubris. As I returned to my position, the room exhaled collectively, the balance irrevocably altered. What had been his domain now bore the imprint of accountability, and in that collapse I found not elation, but a profound sense of equilibrium restored. As the final gavel strike reverberated through the chamber, signaling the session's close, a profound stillness settled over the space. Papers shuffled hesitantly, chairs scraped as people rose, but the usual post-hearing bustle felt subdued, weighted by the morning's revelations. I gathered my materials methodically, sliding my notebook into my satchel, capping my pen with a soft click, aware of the shifted dynamics around me. Those who'd once snickered at my expense now avoided my path, heads bowed in feigned concentration on their own affairs, their earlier confidence dissolved into uneasy deference. I stood, smoothing my jacket one last time, and made my way down the aisle. The corridor ahead stretched long and echoing, its walls lined with portraits of stern jurists from eras past, reminders of a system I'd just begun to reshape. Footsteps behind me faltered, a couple of attorneys who'd witnessed the inspector's intervention nodded subtly as I passed, their expressions a blend of admiration and belated regret. No words exchanged, just the quiet acknowledgement that the ground had shifted beneath us all. Pushing through the heavy double doors, I emerged onto the courthouse steps. The midday sun bathed the plaza in golden warmth, a stark contrast to the dim interior fluorescence. Pigeons scattered from the stone ledges, their wings fluttering in the breeze. I paused at the top, inhaling deeply, the air crisp with hints of city exhaust and distant food vendors. It filled my lungs, washing away the residual tension coiled in my chest. The wind picked up then, gentle but insistent, tousling my curls and brushing my skin like a whisper of encouragement. I'd endured, unbowed, emerging not as a victim but as a catalyst. Below, the world continued, pedestrians hurrying by, taxis honking in the street, but for me, this threshold marked a personal threshold crossed. No triumphant fanfare, just the simple act of stepping forward, free from the shadows of diminishment. In the weeks that followed, word of the federal intervention spread like ripples through the legal community, but it was a post on the internal academic forum for judicial studies that truly captured the shift. I discovered it one evening, scrolling through my laptop in my modest apartment, the screen's glow casting soft shadows on the walls. The entry had gone viral within the network, shared hundreds of times with comments piling up from professors, clerks, and aspiring practitioners. The title leaped out, witnessed a judge unravel, and a black woman who silenced him without raising her voice. Penned by a senior law student who'd been in the gallery that day, it recounted the events with vivid clarity. I expected an ethics advisor to be some grizzled veteran buried in paperwork, the author wrote. Instead, Danielle Brooks showed up unassuming, absorbing barbs that would have broken most. Yet she dismantled the power structure quietly, her expertise emerging like a hidden current that swept away pretensions. The piece delved deeper, praising how my composure turned the judge's aggression into self-sabotage. Brooks didn't need theatrics, it continued. Her strength lay in emergence at the precise moment, standing firm as a pillar amid crumbling egos. Readers chimed in below. One dean called it a lesson in resilience, another student admitted it reshaped their view of advocacy. For me, reading it evoked a quiet swell of validation, not pride in the spotlight, but relief that my approach resonated, inspiring others to question entrenched hierarchies. I closed the tab, leaning back against my couch, the city's distant hum filtering through the window. This wasn't about personal acclaim, it was proof that endurance could ignite broader change, turning one woman's stand into a beacon for the overlooked. A month slipped by in a blur of reports, meetings, and quiet reflections, the courthouse incident fading from daily headlines but etching itself into my core. I learned of Judge Cresswell's suspension through a terse email from the Oversight Committee, placed on administrative leave pending a full internal probe into conduct violations. No spectacle, no public reckoning, just the machinery of accountability grinding forward, as it should. Returning to the building felt surreal, the familiar marble steps now carrying a different resonance under my feet. I paused outside room 5, the door slightly ajar, voices of a new session filtering out. On the adjacent bulletin board, amid routine notices and scheduling memos, a modest slip of paper caught my eye. Printed in plain font, it read, "Starting next week, the Judicial Ethics Internship Seminar will be led directly by advisor Danielle Brooks." No fanfare accompanied it, no flashing cameras, no press conferences clamoring for sound bites. Just that simple announcement, tacked up unceremoniously, signaling a shift in the very fabric of this place. I traced the words with my fingertip, the paper cool and unyielding, a tangible marker of transformation. Once, I'd been humiliated here, reduced to a punchline in these halls. Now, I was stepping back as the instructor, poised to guide the next generation through the nuances of integrity I'd fought to uphold. The irony settled over me like a gentle veil, not bitter, but affirming. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation, a quiet revolution where one woman's steadfastness compelled the system to confront its flaws. As I entered the room, heads turned with newfound regard, the air humming with possibility. In that moment, I embodied the change, dignified, resolute, rewriting the narrative from within.